To understand the Cajun genetic mystery, you have to go back to southern Louisiana in the middle of the 20th century, to the doctors who worked along the bayous and began noticing something that did not make sense. The same rare illnesses kept appearing in isolated fishing communities scattered across the swamps. Children who could not control their movements. Infants slowly losing their vision. Families describing cousins, uncles, and siblings who had died from conditions that few specialists outside Louisiana had ever seen. And then came the stranger detail. The surnames repeated. Thibodeau, Boudreaux, Hébert, Landry, Aucoin. Again and again, physicians working in different parishes found the same family names attached to the same disorders. At first, outsiders reached for the easy answers: poverty, ignorance, swamp isolation. But the pattern was too precise to dismiss. These were supposed to be the descendants of scattered refugees, a people broken apart and absorbed into the vast population of North America. By every expectation, their bloodlines should have dissolved into the crowd. Instead, the genetic clues suggested the opposite. Somehow, a displaced people had stayed unusually connected, unusually isolated, and unusually traceable across time. And the deeper anyone looked, the more the mystery widened. Because this story did not begin in Louisiana. The surviving refugees slowly began moving south. Some traveled back through France. Others drifted through the Caribbean, carried by the currents of empire and circumstance. Eventually, scattered groups of displaced Acadians reached Spanish-controlled Louisiana, where colonial authorities saw real value in settling experienced farmers and fishermen across the remote wetlands. To exhausted people who had lost everything, it looked like a new beginning, a place to rebuild, a chance to gather what remained of their families and start again on unfamiliar ground. But hidden inside that migration was the first true piece of the genetic mystery. The population arriving in Louisiana was already small, a fraction of the wider French population of North America. Many bloodlines had vanished entirely during the deportation. Others survived only through a handful of individuals, a single branch of what had once been a large family tree. Without understanding what they carried, the Acadians brought a narrow genetic inheritance into the bayous with them. They did not know it, but the makeup of the entire future population was already being decided by who had simply managed to live. The exile had shaped the survivors, and now geography was about to take that small, fragile inheritance and lock it in place for generations to come. Southern Louisiana looked nothing like the world the Acadians had lost. In place of cold Atlantic coastlines, they found wetlands, cypress forests, flooded marshes, clouds of mosquitoes, and slow-moving black water that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Large stretches of the region were difficult to cross even in daylight. Roads barely existed. Many communities could be reached only by boat. But for refugees who had already lost everything, that isolation carried one quiet advantage. Few outsiders wanted the land. By the late 18th century, Acadian settlers had established communities across the bayous and prairies of southern Louisiana, in the region that would later be called Acadiana. Families clustered near waterways, churches, and small farming settlements. Travel between villages remained slow for generations, and that single fact mattered far more than anyone realized. Elsewhere in North America, growing cities and expanding transportation networks steadily mixed populations together. But large parts of Cajun Louisiana stayed insulated deep into the 19th century. Parish records show recurring marriages between the same extended family networks, not because anyone understood genetics, but because the social world itself remained small and geographically contained. The bayou functioned almost like a natural barrier. Some researchers later compared these settlements to island populations, places where small founding groups stayed connected across centuries. Rivers, swamps, language, and culture all reinforced the separation, and the inheritance kept quietly concentrating. By the early 20th century, some Cajun communities had become so interconnected that residents could trace relationships across entire parishes without ever opening a written record. One family name linked to another, cousins married into neighboring fishing villages, church cemeteries filled with the same surnames carved again and again into weathered stone. People along the bayou sometimes joked that everyone down there was related somehow. But behind the humor, families were beginning to notice something far more painful. Certain illnesses kept returning, generation after generation. Parents described children who developed normally at first, then slowly lost their coordination, their speech, their sight. Some families watched several siblings die young from neurological conditions that local doctors could not even name. Others carried disorders so rare that physicians outside Louisiana had never once encountered them. For decades, many Cajun families kept these tragedies private. Illness carried stigma, especially in communities already mocked for their accents, their poverty, their rural lives. Some parents refused to speak of hereditary disease at all. Others feared their children would never marry if the truth became known. And yet, the pattern was sitting there in plain sight, preserved inside the records. Researchers who later studied parish archives found extraordinarily deep family connections reaching back to a surprisingly small number of Acadian ancestors. The same names that surfaced in modern medical investigations matched the names written into church documents from the 1700s and 1800s. The mystery was no longer only medical, it had become historical. In the second half of the 20th century, Louisiana physicians and genetic researchers finally began studying these disorders systematically, and what they found surprised even the specialists. One of the strongest clues involved Tay-Sachs disease, a rare inherited condition that slowly destroys nerve cells over time. In medical literature, Tay-Sachs had become closely associated with certain Ashkenazi Jewish populations, where historical isolation had raised carrier frequencies. So when researchers started identifying Tay-Sachs cases among Cajun families, it stopped them cold. Studies through the 1970s and the 1980s found that some Cajun communities carried distinct Tay-Sachs mutations not commonly seen anywhere else. And when scientists traced the family histories, the affected individuals connected back, again and again, to early Acadian settlers. The names kept resurfacing. Medical teams mapping inherited disorders across southern Louisiana found clusters concentrated in specific parishes and bayou settlements, the genetic fingerprint of a population that had stayed isolated for centuries. Before I show you the last part, if you've ever looked at your own results and wondered where Acadian ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put it all together in a guide called Where Do You Really Come From? Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. The Catholic parish records made it possible. Baptisms, marriages, and burials, preserved with remarkable consistency, became a map through time, letting researchers follow surnames and reconstruct how these mutations traveled across generations. For much of American history, Cajun communities were portrayed as backward people trapped in the swamps. Hollywood reduced them to caricatures. Newspapers mocked their accents. In Louisiana schools, some Cajun children were punished for speaking French well into the 20th century, pressured to abandon their language and disappear into mainstream American culture. So when the genetic mystery surfaced, many outsiders reached for the simplest, ugliest explanation they could find: inbreeding. Isolated swamp people, the assumption went, marrying their relatives for generations. But researchers studying population genetics warned that the truth was far more complicated and far less convenient for the stereotype. The Cajuns were not isolated by some failure of character. Their history began with forced displacement, mass death, and the shattering of an already small refugee population. Only afterward did geography, language, religion, and economic separation reinforce the boundaries around their communities. And crucially, most Cajun marriages were not close relative unions in the way outsiders imagined. The real mechanism was something geneticists call a limited founding population. When relatively few ancestors contribute disproportionately to everyone who comes later, rare mutations can become common over time, without any widespread close inbreeding at all. That distinction mattered because the stereotype did real damage. Some families avoided medical studies, terrified of being labeled defective or primitive. Others refused to discuss inherited illness in public. The stigma itself made diagnosis and counseling harder. And still, the deeper question remained: if inbreeding was not the answer, what was concentrating these mutations so powerfully? The answer would force researchers to look far beyond Louisiana. As genetic research expanded in the late 20th century, scientists began comparing the Cajuns to other isolated populations around the world, and the similarities were striking. Communities in Quebec, Iceland, Finland, and among the Amish had all shown unusual concentrations of certain inherited disorders tied to historical isolation. But the details differed. Some of these populations carried high rates of disease despite very little close relative marriage, which meant cousin marriage alone could never explain the Cajun case. Something else had to be concentrating these mutations. The breakthrough came when scientists stopped studying individual families and started reconstructing demographic history itself. The Acadian refugees who reached Louisiana were not a random sample of a larger population. They were a survival group shaped by deportation, disease, starvation, and fragmentation. Entire family lines had vanished in the expulsion. Others lived on through only a handful of descendants. In genetic terms, the population had passed through a bottleneck. That single fact changed everything. Rare mutations carried by just a few survivors could become disproportionately common in later generations, especially once those communities stayed isolated in the bayous. Descendants centuries later might inherit the same mutations, not because their recent ancestors were closely related, but because nearly everyone traced back to the same small founding group. The implication was unsettling. A catastrophe from the 1700s was still shaping medical outcomes 200 years later. Exile, isolation, and inheritance were finally tied together into a single explanation. Today, the Cajuns are no longer hidden deep beyond the Louisiana swamps. Their music travels the world. Their food became part of American culture. Their French dialects, once punished in schoolrooms, are now preserved through festivals, cultural organizations, and language revival efforts across Acadiana. But beneath that revival lies the deeper story that few outsiders ever understood. The Cajun genetic mystery was never really about swamp people or strange folklore. It was the biological echo of exile. A refugee population shattered in the 1700s, pushed into isolation, and slowly reshaped across generations by survival itself. The children those Louisiana doctors studied decades ago were connected through an unbroken chain to burning Acadian villages on the coast of Canada. History had survived inside families long after the official records faded. And maybe that is the strangest part of all. The bayou did not erase the Acadians. It protected them. Their language survived. Their identity survived. Even the hidden signatures buried inside their DNA survived. The lost people of the bayou were never truly lost. They were only waiting to be understood. If your family carries a story no one ever fully explained, a surname, a rumor, an old illness, or a forgotten place of origin, share it in the comments and subscribe for more documentaries uncovering the hidden histories still living inside us.